Do you have a self? Are you really sure? I believe nobody in this room ever was or had a self. How would it feel for you if you came to discover that you really had no self, literally, not as some romantic fantasy, but as a matter of crystal clear logic and a hard scientific fact? I think there is no such thing as a self. The self is not a thing, but it's a process. It's a very special process, and it's that process that gives us the conscious experience of being someone. I have brought 4 examples to you. How do you get that robust identification with the body that makes the step from being no one to being someone on the level of conscious experience? So how many of you have heard of the rubber hand illusion? This is a classical illusion which was first published in 1998, and this is something you can all do at home when you come home tonight. You take a little dishwashing glove, perhaps, and stuff it with cotton. And then you put that dishwashing glove on the table and conceal your own hand from view. Then you have your friend stroke the rubber hand in front of you and your invisible hand with a Q-tip or with a brush synchronously. And then after 20 to 90 seconds, you will experience the rubber hand illusion. Don't giggle, don't laugh, don't look into the experimenter's face. You will suddenly have the feeling as if the rubber hand is part of your own bodily self. And there is something more fascinating. You will be able to feel the seen touch on the rubber hand in the rubber hand, right? What you can also do is you can try to bend the rubber fingers of your friend when he has the illusion into an impossible position. So you see, this is not just some story. This is not an illusion only. The unconscious self model in the brain somehow knows it too. It takes it seriously. So if we want to understand the title of this talk, what it means, we have to understand one concept, and that's the concept of a self model. You don't have a self right now, but you all have a conscious self model active in your brain, a representation of yourself as a whole, as a distinct entity. And that is not a thing, but an ongoing process, the process of modeling yourself and your global properties on the level of the organism as a whole. A self model is a fantastic window that connects your inner life, for instance, with the social world outside of you. As we have seen in the rubber hand illusion, we know a number of things. A self model has to do with ownership, with the experience of owning something. Your hand, your body, your tactile sensation, your feeling, your own thoughts. It is also something that is very context sensitive and fluid. It can be manipulated. And it is something that has to do with body representation. Animals have self-models too. Our self-model is grounded on body representation in the brain. And if there's an evolution of self-models on our planet, one might also ask, is there an innate core to the human self-model? How many of you have heard of phantom limbs? Do you know what a phantom limb is? After amputation, many people feel a limb still which they own. But some people who are born without limbs also have limbs. So here I brought one example to you. It's a 50-year-old cognitively lucid academic, a woman with a PhD in Switzerland. She was born without arms and legs. And since she can remember, she has felt these phantoms. And they have interesting properties. For instance, the middle 3 toes are not differentiated. Now, what one has done is ask this woman on a scale from 0 to 7, how real are your phantoms? So 0 means I have no conscious experience. 7 means this is just as realistic as the body. So one interesting fact is that the right hand is more real than the left hand. See, that right hand has never existed as an input source to the learning brain, right? Can you do like this? Touch your thumb with your fingers, one after another? And if you do that with closed eyes and stop 0.5 millimeter before you touch, you can already feel the boundary of the thumb. They did that experiment with this woman too. They put her in a scanner and made her touch her phantom thumb with her phantom contralateral fingers. And you could exactly see what areas in the brain light up in the moment when this conscious experience is there. See, that's what I mean by a phenomenal self model. It's something in the brain, very obviously, but the deeper question is, what does it represent? Is it the soul? Here's an older colleague of mine, Aristotle. He said 2,500 years ago, the soul is the form of the body, the global shape of the body in space. Is that what we are discovering right now? The inner form of the body? We have actually a long tradition. Spinoza said the soul is the idea that the body develops of itself. But is there not something deeper? Something like a global sense of ownership, of owning the body as a whole. So as you may know, I collaborate with neuroscientists as a philosopher, and with my colleagues Binja Lengenhager, Ted Stadi, and Olaf Blanke a number of years, we've tried out this classical experiment. I thought immediately when I did the rubber hand illusion for the first time, can there be a whole body analog of it? Can there be a whole body version of the rubber hand illusion? And this picture that you may have seen already shows you how this could be done. You wear goggles, the computer inserts you into a virtual room, somebody strokes your back, and you see yourself like you've never seen yourself from behind being stroked.
Of the subject.
Let's look at this.
We stroke the back of the experimental subject. We had a camera, not in front, but behind the subject, 2 meters behind, who was filming the stroking, and in real time projected this information to a head-mounted display, which was in front of the subject's eyes. So all the subject was seeing is the stroking, but now at your back, while at the same time you see your own body being touched by 2 meters in front of you. And some of the subjects reported that they very strongly felt the subject eyes, we displaced them to another position in the room, and then we asked them with eyes closed to walk back to the position. And when they were doing this, they actually did not go back to their real position, to my position right now, but rather were closer actually to where they saw the body.
So we think the minimal sense, the most simplest sense of self, has 3 dimensions: self-localization in space, identification with a body image or an avatar, for instance, and the having of a perspective. Now, the concept of a self-model has already done good work in consciousness research. I'll just explain a second, much easier concept to you from philosophy, the concept of transparency. The idea is consciousness is like a window. You see through it, you see with it, you live through that transparent window, but you don't see the window itself. Consciousness is like a high-dimensional window pane. This man was one of the founding fathers of analytical philosophers, just like Bertrand Russell or Ludwig Wittgenstein, following in the footsteps of Gottlob Frege. And this man was fascinated by the following observation: you can never experience consciousness as such. Have you ever noticed this? It's an intriguing fact. You can see the contents of consciousness, the greenness of the chair, how I look. But if you try to attend to the consciousness of it all, the consciousness is invisible. That is what philosophers call transparency. Almost all conscious states are transparent. Unconscious states are neither transparent nor opaque. So we don't see the window, but only the bird flying by. And this gives us the experience of being directly in contact with the world. You do not see the neurons firing away in your brain right now, but you only see what they represent for you. Perhaps a probability distribution. Conscious experience is an integrated model of reality, and it functions as a medium for you. But in some cases, we are unaware of information channels also. We can be unaware of the medium through which information reaches us. That means we have the feeling of being direct in touch. Philosophers call this the phenomenology of direct realism, and it creates the experience that something exists and that it is real. Human brains are ontology engines, reality machines. They create an experience of what is existing and what doesn't exist. Now, the only point I want to make in this talk is, imagine you had systems, maybe you are such systems, which have conscious self-models, which are transparent. Then these systems would by necessity have the feeling of being in direct and immediate contact with themselves. By necessity, they would feel infinitely close to themselves. They would be like beings that are glued to the content of their self-model, identifying with it. So here is my last example. There is now a fantastic international research project, the VERA project, and what I want to briefly show you now has nothing to do, it's not my own work in any way, it's the work of these two geniuses in Tel Aviv, Doron Friedman and Ori Cohen. So let us look at this. One thing you might be able to imagine is that just by movement sensations, by generating motor imagery, motion ideas, you could control an avatar directly with your brain. This is something that can be done today. This works today. I have introduced a technical concept for this. I call this PSM actions, because you act with your conscious self-model and you bypass the non-neural body. It needs a new concept because human beings have never ever done anything like this before. Now the next logical step is, could you directly, only with your motor imagination, create a real-world physical robot while looking through its eyes? And the answer is yes.
The decoded mental activities are sent over the internet to France.
You are lying in the scanner here in Israel. This is what you see through the robot's eyes in France.
The humanoid robot in France receives the high-level commands and performs them. The subject in Israel sees the world through the eyes of the robot in France. An assistant in France gestures to the subject, suggesting the areas to explore in the room.
So if we had a self-model, even if it was an extended self-model, and the causal loop creating that self-model would be transparent, then we would get the phenomenology of identification. So are we really transposing the self into a robot? Are we uploading? No, we're not uploading. What we are doing is we causally integrate the conscious self-model in the brain with an extended system, for instance, a robot, via a complex causal loop. So it is more like the robot is possessed not by a devil, but by something much worse, by a human being, right? So the same point applies. The prediction is as soon as the medium, the extended loop, gets so robust and fast that the user cannot introspect the construction process anymore, the phenomenology of identification will result. The phenomenology of I am this here and now. And maybe you have been systems like this. Maybe you now have a deeper understanding what I mean when I say the self is not a thing, but a process. The body is the robot, as it were. Consciousness is the robot's own virtual reality. And the conscious self is the grounded avatar in your brain. Now, this may strike some of you as overly reductionistic, perhaps even as dangerous. But I think it has great spiritual depth and it has great philosophical depth as well. But that's another story.